Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's EPC Online Policy Dialogue Loss and Damage Fund, Time to Walk the Talk. This event is part of Connecting Europe's series on global climate action, organized in partnership with the Global Solutions Initiative. I'm Brooke Moore, a policy analyst for EPC's Sustainable Prosperity for Europe program, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. We have an excellent panel of 6 speakers with us today, who I will introduce in the order of speaking before I dive into the background of our discussion today. So we'll first be hearing from Claire Miranda, Deputy Program Manager of the Climate Justice Program at the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development. Claire is also actively part of the civil society network working around the fund for responding to loss and damage. Then we'll be hearing from Stella Brozek-Everaert, International Relations Officer at DG Klima at the European Commission, who is also a member of the Executive Committee of the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage, and of the advisory board of the Santiago Network, as well as advisor to the board member of the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, Mr. Jan Dusik. Then hear from Pooja Dave, policy coordinator and thematic lead on loss and damage for Climate Action Network International. Sebastian Lesch, German board member to the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage, and also the head of the Climate Policy Unit for the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development. Mbungu, Senior Fellow and Head of the Climate Change Program at the Africa Policy Research Institute, and Lorriann Robertson, Founder and Director of the Advocacy team, who in this capacity has worked on the question of financing loss and damage. Now, today's discussion is centered on the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. As many of you know, loss and damage refers to the economic and non-economic losses and damages resulting from climate change. As you may also know, these catastrophic harms are disproportionately borne across communities, being felt particularly severely by nations that have historically contributed the least to emissions. And while the issue of loss and damage has long been discussed within multilateral fora, momentum and recognition surrounding a dedicated fund has propelled in recent years. At COP27, the fund was established, and at COP28, the fund was operationalized with some startup pledges as well. Once up and running, the fund will be a crucial mechanism to address these unavoidable losses and damages that are already and will continue to be felt as a direct consequence of climate change. So where do we stand now? The fund is still being set into motion, with many specifics still being worked out. Providing a backdrop to these discussions are also calls for reform of the international financial architecture more generally, calling for things like enhanced access, harmonized procedures, etc. And this is part of exactly what we want to get into today. So not only understanding the state of play surrounding loss and damage, but the priorities and challenges surrounding the fund as we head into COP29 this November, with the goal of producing an inclusive and effective fund that really benefits those it's intended to benefit. So we'll begin with each of our speakers, who will deliver a quick interjection or pitch, if you will, outlining 1 to 2 key priorities or issues related to loss and damage. After this, we'll hear from our respondent for today. This is Remy Weber, Program Manager for the Global Solutions Initiative, who will get our discussion started with some initial comments and questions to our speakers. After this, the floor will be opened up for discussion and Q&A with the audience. So for those of you watching today, please type any questions you have in the chat as we go along, or of course, when the time comes, you can raise your hand and we will then give you the floor. And speakers as well, a reminder to prepare any follow-ups or questions you may have for other speakers based on their initial remarks. So without further ado, I pass the floor to our first speaker, Claire Miranda, who unfortunately will need to leave us at 4 today, but has logged on to share with us first few thoughts. So Claire, thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I assume many of us are familiar with the concept of loss and damage, but in this presentation, I would like to just reiterate that loss and damage is the result of worsening climate impacts. But another reason why we are experiencing loss and damage is because of climate inaction. Scientists attest that if we acted sooner, or if mitigation and adaptation measures were implemented immediately and adequately in the previous years, we would have prevented climate change from getting much worse. And when it comes to climate inaction, I think this photo of government representatives discussing ways on how they can avoid their responsibility and advance their business as usual agenda can best describe it. Another question we may have in mind when we're looking at loss and damage is how much is the scale of need? This may be a hot topic right now in light of the negotiations in the UNFCCC, but we know that loss and damage is quite difficult to quantify as it takes various forms and affects people and communities in varying degrees. So these are difficult to quantify, but estimates show that by 2030, annual loss and damage costs for the Global South will be between 447 to 894 billion. The discussion about loss and damage and how to address it is currently happening in the UNFCCC. And for us in the climate justice movement, this space is crucial because the convention recognizes the Global North's historical responsibility as reflected in the principle of the common but differentiated responsibility, which many developing countries and civil society fought hard for and hold on to. However, the UNFCCC is also the space where climate inaction has become more obvious, especially for loss and damage. Those responsible or governments of the Global North has derailed the process for years, and it has been a developed versus developing country fight since then. And on the right, it is just a preview of the slow progress of negotiations around loss and damage in the UNFCCC. It took them 31 years before they were able to respond to the proposal of Vanuatu in 1991. And if it weren't for the destructive Typhoon Haiyan, the Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage will not be established. It was only in COP27, as mentioned earlier, where they agreed to establish financial arrangements, including a standalone fund dedicated to cover the cost of irreversible climate impacts. And from there, still very little progress. We've heard the announcement in Dubai, the amount of pledges is still less than 1% of what is actually needed, and only $10 million has been delivered so far. So given all these updates and anticipating that we still have a long way to go in the fund for responding to loss and damage, what is our battle cry? As movements from the Global South, we demand reparations. I'm sure many of us have heard the term, but it is crucial that this call is understood also by our representatives sitting at the negotiations with the power to implement changes. We demand reparations for the huge climate debt owed to us in the Global South, derived from centuries-old extractive activities, excessive production and consumption of the Global North, resulting in climate change and our people and communities suffering the most. This climate debt remains unpaid and goes higher by the minute as actions supposed to be delivered urgently are not met. Instead, we've seen rich countries derail progress, deny their obligations, and advance measures that continue to harm the planet and worsen climate change, leading to massive losses and damages. We need to emphasize that reparations is our right and their obligation, and that we don't need it in the form of loans. It is not a charity aid or assistance that they claim as the extension of their help to us. It is their obligation, and it is means for restorative justice, because given the extent and gravity of the losses and damages inflicted upon the Global South, we know all these can never be fully repaid. Climate impacts have altered our way of living, and there is no way to return to the pre-climate change conditions. But we seek reparations because reparations aim to right the past and wrongs, the present wrongs, and repair the injustices done down to its root cause. So in all these talks about loss and damage and the debates in the UNFCCC, when we demand reparations, it is important to emphasize that it is not limited to demanding just finance or for rich countries to set a target and meet the set target. It involves finance, but not only finance. It requires systemic transformation involving all measures necessary to give back the space that was taken away from the Global South and restore the health of the planet to the fullest extent possible. And with that, I end my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, for this overview and also highlighting, I would say, perhaps the normative imperative of loss and damage. And you importantly made this note of not loans. This is, of course, a large topic of debate surrounding climate financing more generally, specifically that supplying countries often favor loans over grants, exacerbating debt in recipient countries. As I know you are needing to leave us very shortly, I'd like to ask you just a quick follow-up question to hear a bit more of your perspective in this regard specifically. So if you could just briefly maybe expound upon this issue as it relates to the fund, I'd be appreciative. Thank you.
Yep, thank you. Yes, very important to emphasize that when we are talking about, as mentioned, we're talking about reparations, and this is the obligation of the global north because the climate crisis is predominantly, global south communities and countries have the least contribution to the climate crisis, and therefore they owe us a huge climate debt. Giving us loans or all these instruments that would, return to even if it's a small portion of profit is another form of injustice because the global south are suffering already, and then giving loans as a form of climate finance or support to address the losses and damages that we are experiencing right now is unfair because it's not our choice to be in this position where we are. Our new reality is to really face the losses and damages. Giving us loans will only also further worsen the situation or the conditions that we are now, where most of the global south countries are buried deep in their debts, historical debts. Some of them are illegitimate, some of them are odious debts, but we are in that reality where the economic crisis is really felt because of the debt payments that the global south are paying continuously.
Thank you very much, Claire, for expounding upon that and then joining us today. And next we will be hearing from Stella. So Stella, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brooke, for giving me the floor, and thank you very much to EPC for the invitation. As you have introduced me already, I come here in my capacity as working for the European Commission, but also being representative in the two loss and damage bodies, the Warsaw International Mechanism Executive Committee and the Santiago Network Advisory Board. So two bodies that have been created before the fund has been created for responding to loss and damage. And I also serve as advisor to the EU board member in that fund. So happy to bring those perspectives, but also acknowledging that there are several EU member states that are engaged in the board of the fund for responding to loss and damage. And Sebastian, the German board member, will also speak later in the session. So let me just start by saying that the EU as a whole is strongly committed to fully operationalize the new funding arrangements and the fund for responding to loss and damage. That was demonstrated, of course, by the contributions of over 2/3 of the initial funding pledges that were made by the EU and the EU member states. The European Commission that I represent made a pledge of 25 million euros from the EU budget to contribute to the fund. So we want to make sure that the fund is made operational as quickly as possible. And in that sense, I think the swift and efficient proceedings of the first 3 meetings of the board show that this is a shared intention of all the members of the board to really operationalize the fund as soon as possible to the benefit of the most vulnerable countries. I would really like to underscore the progress that was achieved in a relatively short span of time on this fund operationalization. So let me just quickly mention the key milestones for those that perhaps were not so much tuned in to the meetings of the board. There was a decision on the host country for the fund that was made. The executive director has already been selected, as well as at the last meeting just a couple of weeks ago, there was an endorsement by the board of the 5th World Bank documentation, which will actually allow the board to report to the COP and CMA later this year in November that the conditions that were set up in the Dubai decision in the governing instrument are able to be met. And despite that necessary focus of the fund and the fund board on this administrative setup that took a lot of time, the board also had exchanges between the board members, but also with inputs from civil society stakeholders at the past meetings on the so-called operational model. And as we move along on those kind of making the step away from the fundamental setting up to more kind of operational discussions, we do expect more in-depth conversations on that topic at the 4th meeting that is coming up in December. So I think this event is really a good opportunity to listen to the views of how to best create a model for the fund that responds to what was agreed in the governing instrument. So I'm really looking forward to hearing the inputs specifically on that during this discussion. And we have expressed in the interventions that were made by the board member representing the EU in the board that it is for us of utmost importance that the fund is open to a wide range of stakeholders, particularly including communities, indigenous people, and vulnerable groups such as youth, children, migrants, and displaced people. So all of those who are most affected by climate change are often outside of the reach of other kind of more established funds and mechanisms. And I think this is especially the case for fragile and conflict-affected areas. So let me just highlight one element for discussion today. I understand that several speakers or other interventions may focus more specifically on the fund, but I would like to maybe bring the perspective of the wider landscape and speak briefly about the coherence of this wider loss and damage landscape and maximizing impact. Because from our perspective, the fund is an important element of the loss and damage support landscape, but it's not an exclusive one. And we should be really considering the kind of the broader understanding of the complexity of the challenges related to averting, minimizing, and addressing loss and damage. So in addition to the work of the board of the fund, we cannot also forget that we need to maximize the work and impact of existing funding arrangements that already provide support in responding to loss and damage, and that they should really complement each other. As was also agreed in Dubai, this complementarity should be enabled through the best use of existing mechanisms. So the ones that I have the honor sitting in, like the Executive Committee of the WIM and the Santiago Network, should really play a role in that. And looking ahead to the COP29 and CMA6 in Baku later this year, we will actually have an opportunity of the review of the Warsaw International Mechanism that can really look into the kind of maximizing of the work and the outputs of the 3 loss and damage bodies, so the EXCOM, the Santiago Network, and the new fund for responding to loss and damage, and how they can produce user-friendly knowledge through close collaboration with the different elements of the landscape, build capacity, enable access to funding streams from both the fund and the broader funding arrangements. So let me stop here, and I'm happy to come back on some other aspects relating to the fund and react to some of the other interventions. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much for that. I think it's indeed an important point to raise, in that, of course, the loss and damage fund isn't happening in a silo. It's meant to happen in complement with these other tools and mechanisms. And given your expertise, I'd like to ask just one smaller technical detail that perhaps could help with the audience, and that's more this role of the intermediary host that we're seeing. So what exactly this means, the World Bank is involved, and what happens after this period expires, and if this temporary arrangement factors largely into the decisions being taken now, just very briefly.
Sure. So as perhaps the viewers also know, there were conditions that were set in the governing instrument that was setting up the fund in the decision from Dubai for the World Bank to become the host, so the trustee of the fund, but also the host of the Secretariat of the fund. And there were discussions in between the board and the World Bank to ensure that those conditions can be met. And at the last meeting, it was actually decided that they can be met, and this documentation that was agreed between the board and the World Bank has been finalized. But in the interim, of course, the work of the board needed to start. So there was an interim secretariat that was set up that included entities, the UNFCCC and the UNDP, as well as the World GCF colleagues who were supporting the kind of the preparations and the running of the meetings of the board and all those initial stages before the official secretariat can take over. As I have mentioned, the executive director of that has already been decided, and that is kind of the first step also in setting up the secretariat, the independent secretariat of the fund.
Thank you very much. And next we'll be hearing from Pooja. So thank you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Brooke, and thank you, EPC, for inviting me. It's my pleasure. I'm Pooja, as introduced. I work as policy coordinator with Climate Action Network. Speaking to loss and damage fund, we already hear that loss and damage is not having, sorry, excuse me. Sorry for that. Loss and damage fund does not exist in silos. There are existing mechanisms, and synergies through those mechanisms is key, and linking with those mechanisms is crucial. We also heard from Claire that we need a systemic transformation. There is a call for systemic changes. There is a call for changing the existing system, whether it is the financial system as well. And while UNFCCC is all about climate action, we have seen climate inaction within UNFCCC, and our battle cry is to pay the climate debt that the global north has to pay to the global south. And on this line, we also know that this is the big COP, the big finance COP. And so when we talk about loss and damage fund or financing for loss and damage, we cannot not speak about the new climate goal that we are going to agree at this COP. And the one most important thing that we need to know that now we have the fund, but just getting the fund is not enough. We need actual finance that can be mobilized to address loss and damage, finance that is directly available to those that are in need. And getting a sub-goal on loss and damage as the third pillar within the new climate finance goal is one of the prerequisite conditions to ensure that we have right resource mobilization. It kind of sets the stage to ensure that loss and damage finance is now being talked about, and there are actual commitments for it within the UNFCCC regime. The previous goal of 100 billion did not really talk about the loss and damage finance or providing financial resources for loss and damage. And the new goal is ideally going to be based on it, right? So going forward into the scope, we need to ensure that we get a sub-goal on loss and damage along with mitigation and adaptation. That sub-goal ensures that financial resources based on the actual needs are provided in form of largely public finance, grant, direct access to the people that those are most vulnerable, and that there is balance in accessibility to resources when it comes to mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. We know how the financial resources are made available. We have been struggling to find that right balance between mitigation and adaptation. And the current need talks about getting that balance through the three most pillars that have been identified within the Paris Agreement, that is mitigation, adaptation, and loss and damage. So those three pillars and ensuring that financial flows among all three are equal and need-based is crucial as we go forward and we talk about those funds and funding and financial mechanism and the overall transformation. But while we do that, it is important that the financial provision is based on the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, and also on the principle of polluters pay. So it needs to flow from developed countries to developing countries, and developed countries must take the lead in providing this financial resources. In the interest of time, I will stop over here so that you can pose other questions as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. And just a very quick follow-up question, if you wouldn't mind outlining the difference between whether or not loss and damage is its own distinct fund or included as a sub-goal within this NCQG.
Loss and damage fund should exist as an individual fund in itself, but within NCQG, a sub-goal provision should be there that ensures that there are right needed synergies and the financial resourcing and the quantum that gets agreed as part of the new goal can rightly identify the actual need of finance that is required to address those loss and damages, and the commitments then through the fund should flow to the vulnerable community or the one that are at the front lines.
Thank you for the clarification. And yes, I'm sure this question of financing, and especially as it relates to COP29, we'll definitely be getting into in the discussion. But next we will be hearing from Sebastian. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Brooke. It's a pleasure to be with you all, and thanks for the invitation. As As described, I am the board member for the Fund Responding to Loss and Damage for Germany. I'm looking forward to this discussion. I don't want to repeat what people have already said, so I'm going to try and focus on a couple of points, linking very much into what Stella said, of course. My first point would be the fund board has worked very intensively and it has worked very constructively. And I really want to underline this constructive spirit in which we walked. It's been a very constructive atmosphere since B1 up to B3 that finished about 2 weeks ago in Baku. And we've made a lot of progress. If you compare to the establishment, say, of the GCF, we've really been working in record time here. Stella has mentioned what we've accomplished, the 5th documentation with the 11 conditions being met. That was not an easy walk for the World Bank. It was not an easy walk for the fund board, but we really make sure that the World Bank moves on those 11 conditions. That was a hard negotiation that we've done and that we've completed. And it has also shown that there is interest on the side of the World Bank to go forward with all of this. We have an executive director. We've even agreed on a name, which is something that sounds trivial, but many didn't think we would ever get there. We did, and in consensus. And we've started discussions on the substance. So I think that's a lot. So when we go back to COP29, we can really report that we've done our job on the fund board and that we will continue to move at that high speed. My second point on this substance, we have the governing instrument. There's everything and nothing in the governing instrument if you look closely. I mean, there's something for everybody in there, but as a fund board, we now need to make sure that we really define out the mechanisms in which this has been working. I've been looking forward to this discussion, particularly because I'm hoping to catch from you what your ideas about those mechanisms are. There's been a long-standing, of course, historically discussion about what loss and damage is and about responsibilities, and some say about reparations, but that doesn't answer the question of what the substance of the fund is going to be, how it is going to work. We have budget support, we have direct access in the substance of the fund. We also have country-led approaches, which I think are very important, national response plans, which I think are very important if we're going to look to building resilience. We also have direct access for non-governmental organizations. This is something that many partners along the fund board, especially from the Global South, governmental partners, do not find that easily digestible that we find it possibly. So this is a discussion that needs to be had in the board. And this is a discussion where we need civil society to accompany us, to give input to all of this, while we as a board agree to move along with some frontrunners, but at the same time not forget to set up the long-term vision, the long-term mode of operation for the fund. There is really groundbreaking work to be done here, and we need all hands on deck for that, I think. Third point on the financing, we have, as many of you would know, in our work plan for 2025 already talk about the replenishment of the fund, even though there hasn't been any replenishment yet. I mean, the funds that have been pledged along COP28 were sort of an advanced, a front-loaded trust into a fund that didn't even exist at the time. And I want to really underline that that is not something that we do very often as the German government. I'm sure the same goes for others. To sort of pledge something, and in our case, jointly with the United Arab Emirates, also another, I think, groundbreaking participation. Somebody said polluters should pay. This is, I think, the way also to look at this. Now, but only just now, we have a fund with an account number that we can actually disperse that money to. Claire mentioned at the beginning that the only money dispersed was the Japanese money. That's right, but it's also a little unfair. I mean, the Japanese gave this for the interim secretariat. Now is the moment where we really have a fund that we can actually pay into. We will do that very soon. We hope that others follow suit. And then, of course, replenishment is something that we can talk about in 2025, but that is also very strongly linked to the substance of the fund, of course, from where we stand. You know, when I go to Parliament asking for that money, then, of course, I'll have to tell them what does the fund actually do and how does it work. So these two are very much interlinked. This is not solely an NCQG discussion, but also something that's linked to the substance of the fund. And then, fourthly, as I hope you gather from what I'm saying here, we are very much committed to the new fund as Germany. We have very constructively participated in the transitional committee. We have very constructively worked since the establishment of the fund. We are committed to all that's in the governing instrument. That includes budget support, that includes direct access. Of course, we're looking at grant financing. The money that we have provided is grant financing only. But the GI also gives lots of hints about how to make best and most effective use of that money. And that might not in each and every case be money out in terms of a grant. There can be many other instruments used, and the governing instrument talks about those extensively in order to make best use of the money that we put into the fund. I'll stop here in terms of an input, and I'm happy looking forward to the discussion that's coming up. Thank you, Brooke.
I agree. I hope these mechanisms are something we definitely get more into in the discussion. And I do have a follow-up, but I don't want to derail the introductory remarks. However, my question would be on this question of member state contribution, right? Because obviously funds and, political will, and we talk about choosing grants over loans, a lot of this is contingent on the not only political will, but financial capacity of member states to contribute more. And I know that, let's look at Germany specifically. Germany has experienced some, let's say, budget constraints like from 2023 and with 2025 coming up, there's a lot of question on the ability of Germany to really meet these, even the previous 6 billion per year goal, let alone perhaps an increased goal now at COP29. So I guess my question is more about how you perceive the financial capacity to be of Germany, other member states, et cetera. And very briefly, so I hopefully don't derail the introductory remarks, and then we can get into Grace. So thank you.
I'll try and be brief, but I think that's an important question because that's part of the backdrop in front of which we are discussing all of this. I think we have to distinguish between money in and money out in terms of the fund. Money out is what I just said. A grant going out might not always be the most effective use of addressing something. There can be lots of other things that we could potentially do as a fund. We can go into more detail. The governing instrument says some stuff about that. But this is something that the fund board will now look at very closely when it decides which will be those early movers and which will be the things for the long-term vision of the fund. The money in, I think, is what you're asking for here. Of course, those 100 million are grant money. And of course, in terms of the overall climate financing goal, Germany has been able to provide its fair share so far. We are not in an easy budgetary situation right now. That is well known. And we're not the only ones that are in an uneasy budgetary situation right now. We are nevertheless committed to stay engaged. I can't tell you any figures in terms of the future because this is something for the German parliament to decide, obviously. But I think what's very important is to keep an open mind in that discussion. And that's I think, what goes for the NCQG discussion more in general as well. Yes, there is going to be and there needs to be a core of public funding in this. Nobody is denying this. And we don't want to derail the discussion in the sense of talk about other things to sort of take attention away from that core of public finance. That's not what we're doing. There needs to be a core of public finance. But first of all, polluters pay has been mentioned. It's very important to have a broader donor base there. 1992 UNFCCC is not going to be sufficient. This bifurcation is not going to be sufficient. It's not going to be just as well in the foreseeable future. And also we need to make use of other sources of funding in that whole sort of NCQG setting. And also, if we're looking at the fund for responding to loss and damage, that includes all sorts of things. We can talk about guarantees. We can talk about international taxes. Many things are being discussed at the moment. I think that's a very healthy discussion. We need to have that discussion in order also, and I'm going to be quite frank about that. When I go back to domestic budgetary debates, I need to be able to explain that, yes, we will be doing our fair share, and our fair share is a lot of money, but others will be doing their fair share as well. I think that's the sort of give and take that we need to be able to portray in that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you for the follow-up. And I'm sure this question of alternative financing will probably hear a lot from Lorriann as well, given her expertise on this topic as well. But for now, I will pass this to Grace. So thank you.
Thanks a lot. And thanks again for inviting me. And also thanks so much for the speakers that have gone before me. I mean, a lot has been mentioned already in terms of the mechanisms, the Board of Implementation for the Loss and Damage Fund. But just maybe to bring in a bit of my inputs here. When I think about loss and damage, of course, I think about climate change justice. That's really the issue that comes to my mind. And then I think, what does that really mean. So we have instruments, of course, of implementing these processes of ensuring that justice is served. But what does that then, in a sense, mean concretely? On the one hand, there's this group of actors that, of course, have contributed the most to the climate change crisis, but also are continuing to do so. And on the other end, there's this other group of people that have contributed the least, but are continuing to suffer the most. So in this case, of course, there's an issue of urgency to ensure that the groups that are suffering more do not continue to suffer as a result of inaction, as was mentioned earlier in the discussions by Claire. Obviously, the loss and damage acknowledges this inequality and seeks to achieve an equitable distribution of both the burdens of climate change and the efforts to address its impact, and also, most importantly, I think, also mitigate further damage, because we cannot just be talking about addressing the current impacts. We need to make sure that what we are doing now does not give us more burdens that we are unable to act upon in the future due to the costs that is going to come about. So just outcome then of the process might result in scalable finance and, of course, institutional frameworks that support vulnerable countries to adapt. And also, on the other end, for global north countries to really take steps to mitigate CO2 and methane emissions through stopping the use of fossil fuel. So the way I see it in terms of loss and damage, obviously, is addressing the loss and damages that we have now, but making sure that there is no further loss and damages being caused, because this really means the loss of livelihoods. It also really means the loss of social culture, the loss of everything, those that we can and cannot measure, those that we can see and those that we cannot see. So ideally, science has told us what we need to do. And I think part of the process of loss and damage and part of the discussion of loss and damage needs to come hand in hand with both preventing it, but also addressing what has already happened. So what should then implementation look like in the process, of course, of the board and the implementation mechanisms of loss and damage? I think we need, as a people, both the global north and the global south, to have deliberations that really reflect the urgency and scale of the crisis, both now and what could be in the future. And I think I listened to the Senegalese president in New York last week, who said that for us as global south countries, everything about climate change is urgent and the needs are big. So we cannot think small in this respect. We have to both think big and also act quickly. And then in terms of how we implement it, the loss and damage fund, I think as Stella mentioned, there are obviously a lot of processes and mechanisms that have come before the loss and damage, but I think it's important to ensure that there is no fragmentation of these processes as we implement the loss and damage, but also resist the urge to say that, well, we have loss and damage, well, we can reduce the adaptation funds, because loss and damage is an issue on its own, adaptation is an issue of its own, mitigation is an issue of its own. And I think it's really important to address these things coherently, but also as standalone solutions to the climate crisis. I also think that when we talk about climate change or anything to do with climate change, ideally, anything to do with climate change is local. So we, of course, are talking about global mechanisms for climate action, loss and damage implementation, and all that. But I think what we ideally need to, we need to go a little step back and reflect that obviously loss and damage implementation will really require strict considerations of the geographies, resources, political, socioeconomic, and of course, environmental situations of each country. In other words, this will require proper design of specific measures with and for the people that really need it, because we cannot talk about loss and damage as one big cake. We have to start looking at it as these small cakes in order for us to have, of course, the impacts that we are looking for. Last but not least, of course, looking forward to further discussions. capacity building is important. I mean, we've seen in the field of climate change, we have a lot of processes set in place, often very grand ideas, but we don't have those at the local level where action is actually needed. So we can have all these mechanisms, we can see it in various policies and also even provide the finance. But you have to think about, there's a lot of talk, of course, finance, but how is that finance going to be effective? Can we actually use that finance to do anything? Can we actually access that finance? Can people actually use that finance for what it's intended for? So I think some of these questions that go beyond finance are important to discuss alongside the implementation of the Loss and Damage Fund. I'll stop there and look forward to the great discussion. Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thank you very much for this interjection. I think, again, touching upon this important issue of enhanced access, yes, and I guess maybe more of a personal brief question and follow-up, and then we can get to Lorriann, is this, I guess, given the relative youth of multilateral climate funds, of which, of course, the Loss and Damage Fund is one, whether or not you view this as a realistic opportunity to try and implement a lot of these reforms that are, you know, that we talk about, enhanced access, stakeholder engagement, transparency, etc.
Yeah, I do. And I actually think we've done a lot of progress with loss and damage, but we've missed a huge opportunity when it comes to the hosting by the World Bank. There is quite some injustice that we are seeing there. For example, potentially 17% of hosting fee for the World Bank. If you look at the countries that should benefit from loss and damage, the World Bank is the most beneficiary of this fund. So I think when it comes to financial reform, and of course, when we of course understand that we need to anchor it to an institution that can manage the fund. But we also have to think deeper on the issue of injustice that comes along with these kinds of arrangements, and especially in the context of the global financial mechanism and the context of the global North, global South inequalities, and of course, the makeup of the World Bank. So ideally, I think there are processes that are ongoing to reform such institutions. A lot of talk on COP27 and of course COP28 on these. I think there'll be more discussions on these during COP29. But ideally, I think if we want to move fast, we can move fast. But how is this? I mean, we have to think: are we trying to exacerbate already the inequalities that exist? What exactly are we doing by moving fast? Should we even reflect more on these processes? I'm not trying to, in this forum, of course, say that it was wrong to give the World Bank the hosting capacity of the Loss and Damage Fund. But what I'm trying to say is that at least moving forward, we need to think about the unintended consequences of these kinds of processes, and of course, of the broader financial mechanism that we have now for both climate finance, for both loans, for even other global processes, for example, trading, and how global North and global South countries relate with each other. So ideally, that's my take on that point.
Thank you so much. And Lorriann, I'll pass the floor to you for our final initial introduction, and then we can get into the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's always difficult to go last, but I really enjoyed all of the contributions so far today. So thank you so much for inviting me. My name is Lorriann Robinson, and I'm the founder and the director of the Advocacy team. We are a consultancy, and we help organizations with their advocacy, strategy, and campaigning effort. But I believe we were invited to be part of this panel because of a policy report that we published alongside our partners, the development economists at Development Reimagined. And the report looked at this question of financing reparations and loss and damage. What are the options? This was a piece of work that we supported individually between the Advocacy team and Development Reimagined, usually just thinking about how we could apply our expertise as development economists and as political advocates to this question about reparations. And I'll just share some insights from our report, which I think are relevant to the discussion today. So very briefly, our report looked at the financing options, and as Grace did very early on in the discussion, it situates loss and damage very squarely as part of the conversation about reparations. And we do this because the legacy of colonialism and global injustice is linked to the disparities that countries that feel the strongest effects of climate change. And so histories of colonialism and natural resource extraction are inextricably linked to the disproportionate damage that some countries in the global south experience. And for this conversation, we were asked to ask the question, what can the EU do? Our report very much focused on financing levers that governments can use for reparations. And we do this because it's quite clear that the status quo in the absence of a loss and damage fund is not working. So in most cases, governments, as we've heard, governments, when they're dealing with a crisis, be it a cyclone, a natural disaster, they're forced to turn to debt. Those debts can then, as we saw in Mozambique, for example, when they faced with the cyclone, they were faced with up to $2 billion USD in financial costs, which in turn led to them taking on a 118 million IMF loan to try to deal with the damage. And that has multiple consequences, one of which is that the cost of servicing the debt means that takes financing that could be used for more immediate priorities, be they development priorities or climate related priorities. And we also think it's just unjust. And we see huge potential for the Loss and Damage Fund as one of the few mechanisms which is de facto in its conception a reparative justice fund. And we think it's needed because over the years, the options that have been on the table, whether debt or aid, have not risen to the challenge. Aid itself has been problematic for many reasons. And right now we see that aid is just unreliable. So if you look at European countries and their financing for aid, we see that it's on a downward trajectory everywhere from the UK to France, perhaps even Germany, despite the growing crises that we're seeing around the world. So aid has proved to be by itself an unreliable form of financing, and aid has been problematic for many reasons. We don't need to, I'm sure everyone on the call knows them well, and we don't need to kind of delve too far into it. So while it's encouraging to see those early commitments from European countries, and these are very welcome, in our report, we looked at a range of financing options that could be used for reparations and loss and damage. And we looked at them and we assessed them based on a broad criteria. And I'd just like to highlight a few of the criteria that we looked for, because while we see huge potential for the Loss and Damage Fund, there are big questions about how it's implemented. And I think some of these questions are relevant to that. So some of the things that we looked at when we were assessing the different financing levers that could be used is capacity. So how much money could be raised by this type of financing tool? We also looked at the question about time, which is asking kind of how long does it take to get the money out of the door? We asked what sort of burden does it place on the recipient country or the affected community? Questions like how transparent is this finance? Is it possible to follow the money and to see outcomes? We had a broad range of 13 different criteria, and I really think that I'm not suggesting that they're the only things to look at as we're assessing how the Loss and Damage Fund is implemented, but I think that many of them are really relevant. And I think after this, I want to do even more advocacy to encourage the board as it's implementing the fund to really think about these questions, because the answers will make a big difference as to whether this fund meets the expectations, which are growing in the Global South, for what the fund can achieve. And just before I close and open up for discussion, I do just want to focus in on one other criteria that we looked at, which was equity. And it's one of the criticisms that we've had in the report, that we used a broad term of equity when actually we should have been looking at equity from a range of different perspectives. And this is an area where we would love to see much deeper work. So what does the Loss and Damage Fund mean in terms of equity? And I was really encouraged to hear, I believe, Sebastian talk about the fact that there is a role for civil society formally within the structure of the fund as it's developing, and we encourage that. But I think one very practical thing that European countries can do is to support the convening of civil society much more broadly, not only those who have the relative privilege of access to be part of the implementation board, but civil societies from communities affected by loss and damage around the world, and especially women-led communities, because I think it's for them that we want from them, but we want to see a framework for what equity with the respect to loss and damage looks like. And I think giving these kinds of questions due consideration will now, a little bit as we've heard from our last speaker early on, giving consideration to these kind of questions now will make a huge difference as to whether this fund delivers on the transformative potential, or if it becomes just another kind of mechanism within the international financial architecture that promises much but delivers little. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I think in the discussion, it would be quite nice to hear from you what some of these, I guess, mechanisms that you looked at or tools and what were found to be perhaps effective. In the meantime, I will pass it to Remy to provide a very, very brief comment and provide some questions back to the speakers. So thank you.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me. So I'm Remy from the Global Solutions Initiative in Berlin. We're working closely with G20 and G20 related engagement groups, and also have some work on finance and climate finance, which I'm happy to contribute. So we've heard a lot. We've heard about the coming COP26 in Baku. We've heard about restorative justice being key. We've heard about different instruments, aids and loans being difficult, mostly grants, but also other potential instruments that should be part of the reflection of how to implement the fund. We've heard how the fund is embedded in a much more broad landscape about loss and damage, and also the whole UNFCCC and mitigation adaptation finance. So those three pillars. Also looking forwards to the NCQG at the next COP. We've heard that the commitment that were met of 100 billions were nice, but not really speaking to the loss and damage funds, that some pledges have been made already, that some countries, Germany, that the EU, or Japan also, as first pair for the interim secretariat, have shown some concrete support. I think that's a good progress that we've heard a lot about in this discussion already. And I think the discussion will have to focus on how to implement it concretely, as Sebastian and Stella mentioned, what mechanism exactly can be done, what can be done on the dispersing side, but also on the on how to fill it, right? On the, let's say, spending side or filling side. So a key thing also I took away from Grace's commentary is to avoid reproducing injustice, also because it's a new instrument, but based also on the international financial architecture which we have, with the World Bank central to it, which has its own problematic, obviously. So that would be it in a nutshell from my side. Brooke, do you want me to ask a first question, or do you want also to? Okay, so hard sell. I have a lot on my list, but maybe I'll give two, and then you choose who wants to go on it. One would be more the political economy perspective. So we've heard that that it is key to have this restorative justice perspective, and that polluters pay, that the countries more responsible for historical emissions pay. But it's probably a harder sell than saying let's invest in climate transition and in mitigation. So maybe to you, Lorriann or Grace, if you have an idea of how to make this, let's say, more appealable to the funding countries mostly. So that would be one question. And the other, building on what Sebastian and Stella said, is what, or maybe addressing it to yourself, what other funding mechanism you could see beyond grants, but without falling back into the, let's say, old habit of loans and development aid. So that would be to kickstart the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And Yeah, I think Lorriann unmuted. So I don't know if you want to try and go first with this one or these ones.
Sure. I can try and go first and maybe start with your last question first. So as I mentioned, our report looked at a range of mechanisms. Some had been used in the past, others were new instruments. And we asked that very question, you know, what tool comes out strongest based on the criteria that I talked through earlier. And one policy lever that came out very strongly was the use of financial transaction taxes. So yeah, that was the lever that came out most strongly. And we've heard a talk about debt so far, and debt cancellation also came out quite strongly in our report. But crucially, we also found that you know, no single tool or lever will deliver everything, and debt cancellation can be a really good starting point, but it needs to be used in combination with other financing tools. So those would be two that I would just put forward: financial transaction taxes and debt cancellations as things to consider. And then on the question of how do you make this more appealing to the funders, maybe I'm not the best person to answer this. I almost feel like I've spent my whole career trying to make things appealing to funders, and my conclusion is that you just have to tell the truth. And even if people don't like it initially, in the long term, that is probably the most sustainable way. So of course, I'm all for using language that funders are going to be responsive to, etc. I don't think we should promise them that the Loss and Damage Fund will stop migration into Europe. I don't think we should promise them that it will make them global leaders. I think we should almost move away from that sort of approach and just talk honestly about the potential, because actually I think if this is going to be a different fund, we really should try and do it differently.
Thank you so much. And Sebastian, Stella, I don't know if you have a response to that, but I would say also just to speakers in general, if you want to come in to answer a question, please feel free to just raise your hand and we can go. No need to wait for being called upon, let's say. Yeah, perhaps Sebastian, if you'd like to. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, I can do that. Thank you very much. Just jumping into what Lorriann said. I'm on that other side of the table, if you want, and I've spent my whole career there, more or less. But I fully agree with what you say. I mean, honesty certainly helps. This fund is not about stopping migration to Europe or anything of the sort. But this has a very specific role. And I think if you talk about the potential, that's how you framed it. I like that framing very much, because there is a huge potential in the fund. There is a potential to do justice around loss and damage. And there is a potential even beyond that. As I've said in the beginning, we've really pushed the World Bank to new limits. This is also, and I'm very much convinced about this, going to change the fabric of how the World Bank operates. And I know that there's been a lot of hesitation towards the World Bank by many around the table there. But the World Bank has really moved. I mean, if we manage to make direct access something that the World Bank does on a regular basis in that fund, then we've really achieved something far beyond what the fund does. So talk about that kind of potential. And there is a transformative potential also for international cooperation, international aid, if you still want to call it that is within what we do around the fund. Talk about that potential and talk about that. I think that makes a lot of sense. In addition to what I've said earlier, I mean, the value proposition, if you want to call it that, as a fund, needs to be clear to funders as well. We need to go beyond, as much as that is needed, sort of the historical reasoning and arguments that have been made throughout those maybe 30 years that people have been fighting for the fund. But now the fund is there. So now there is the real opportunity to move this forward. So we need to sort of change that mode. This is why I emphasize this constructive mode in the board in the very beginning. We need to get into that mode of actually moving these things forward. They need to develop ideas of how to do that. There is a wide window of opportunity open right now. And for Germany, I can say that really you have all the support there. We're trying to make that work. So everybody who comes around the table with ideas is most welcome to do that. And that leads me to the other part of the question that Remy addressed more into the direction of Stella and myself. Happy to listen to Stella about that as well. But I think the dichotomy between loans and grants is a little bit misleading. the best use of the money going out of the fund might not be a loan or a grant at all. There are many other things that we can talk about. I know that there's a lot of hesitation towards insurance, for example, because the argument is if we move people into insurance, that means they will pay for loss and damage themselves through the premiums. Now, here's an opportunity. Why not talk about the risk pools and see what we can finance out of the funds in terms of premiums for insurance? Just an idea. That means that it's not the poorest who will pay for the insurance premiums, but we can do that out of the fund. But we can leverage the money out of the fund far more than we could with a simple grant funding. Or talk about guarantees for certain investments into preparation of certain risks. We can leverage money a lot by doing that. So these are just two ideas. I'm sure there's many things that are possible, and the governing instrument hints at many of those things. But I think it would be good to be open-minded there, not move into this dichotomy of, it's the World Bank, so it's going to be loans. It's not the World Bank that's going to decide how the money is going to leave the fund. The World Bank is the host of the Secretariat and the trustee, no more, no less. It's the fund board that's going to decide about what the fund is actually going to fund. So we have the possibility to really shape that and make best use of that money. And I would really encourage people to engage constructively in that discussion. I leave it there, but happy to listen to Stella about that as well.
Yeah, thanks so much. Happy to come in on that as well. And of course, fully sharing the view and maybe kind of underscoring the message from Sebastian, who said that the fund is now there. We have the governing instrument that allows a number of options, and it's really for the board to decide on what kind of mechanisms and what tools and what instruments it will be using. So I think we really need to kind of switch this type of thinking of kind of talking in the vacuum a little bit about kind of general wishes for the financial architecture, but really focusing the concrete ideas towards the board of the fund on how they could be put in practice. And fully agree with what Sebastian has said around different instruments. I think also during the transition committee process that led to the setting up of the fund and the further work of the board, there were a number of different instruments that were explored. A lot of lessons were learned, and I think we can kind of bring that knowledge forward and implement it in the new fund, because as has already been said, this is really a new ground. And also with the World Bank setting up the fund as the fifth, they have been very clear that based on the conditions that were set by the governing instrument, this is really a new ground. This is not the type of fund that resembles the other ones. And it is now up to the board and to those who, from the civil society, who have a seat around the table and who can contribute to those discussions to really put it into practice. Maybe just a comment also on the kind of the different instruments that were presented by Lorriann. I think it's really interesting to learn about the tools that came up in the study. So really looking forward to having more detail on that. I can say that also from the European Commission perspective, we are exploring internally different opportunities for innovative climate finance that would help those critical objectives relating to supporting climate vulnerable countries and communities. We have commissioned some internal research ourselves as well in that regard. So we're looking into potential levies, operationalizing the polluter pays principle, and we expect some findings by the end of this year that we will capture in a kind of executive summary and more extensive report. So happy also to share that, because as was said, I think before, it's not, and that maybe comes back to the NCQG discussions, which are still ongoing. This is not to kind of look away from the core of the public finance, but it's really about extending the options for financing. And we really need to look at the broader base and at the broader opportunities to find that finance where it's available. And from our side, I think we are also happy to show our contribution to as the EU to achieving of the 100 billion goal in 2022. So I think around 100 billion US dollars at the time came from the EU sources. and 22 million or more than 22 million out of that was in the form of bilateral finance. So for the EU, the bilateral public finance, over half of it has been directed to either the least developed countries or to low middle income countries. So I think that also really speaks to some of the points that were made by speakers, Grace and others, on making sure that the finance is really contributing or benefiting the most vulnerable and those who have contributed the least to the climate change, but also have the least capacity to deal with some of the impacts. So I think I'll leave it at that for those questions, but I also have a lot of kind of comments on some of the other points that were made, including from Grace, that happy to come back on to.
Yeah, thank you. And I think for now, it would be nice to hear Pooja. I know that CAN International is doing a lot of work on this, so I think it would be great to hear your thoughts on that. But I'd also ask Sebastian, there is perhaps a longer, more technical question in the chat or in the Q&A, if maybe you wouldn't mind either reading it and we can discuss it or answering written, and then I'll pass the floor to you, Pooja.
Particularly focusing on what has been raised and what has been said in terms of avenue and exploring. Fund on loss and damage is not a profit-making system. It is not for making any sort of profit from the harm that is done. As Claire rightly said, that we need to talk about reparation. We need to talk about addressing the harm that is done. So while we explore other avenue on how do we provide that, insurance and no longer can provide that climate justice. Right, as very rightly said, that loss and damage is a justice issue, and it needs to be based on those principles of justice, equity, and human rights. So when we talk about that, we want access to finance for those vulnerable community should be through direct finance access window. And it should be readily available and provided, and it should be through compensation. And when we look at compensation, the whole spectrum of compensation should be looked at while exploring other avenue. It is also holds true when we talk about, in general, what will be the resources for finance. We largely see that public finance, by introducing various mechanisms through which we can elevate public finance, by taxing the wealthiest, by leading and taxing the most richest who have caused this, can also provide those resources and finance. So what is currently most urgent and needed is to sort out all those ways that we are ready to disseminate the finance which is available. We have some commitments which are already as part of the fund, and we are now waiting for the full operationalization. But while we do that, we need to readily make those finance available to those that are at the front line and those currently needed. I can just pose an example that while I sit in Canada, my home back in India got flooded twice in a window of 2 weeks, and that caused so much of damage. So how are we going to take into account all those sort of damages? The extremity of flooding was so high that the potential risk was so high that those losses have not been accounted for, and it is very difficult to account it. So if the fund has been set up and if money is there that can be directly provided to those who are in need, we should start rolling those things rather than exploring into various avenues and waiting for World Bank to come up with its meet those 11 criterias and other things, but how those direct access windows can be provided. And absolutely not. For CAN, it should not be in form of insurance. It should be direct access and compensation modes.
Thank you very much. And I think on this topic of access, I think, Grace, you had mentioned looking beyond this question of simply financing, but all of these various modalities, let's say, of a fund. So things like direct access, things like stakeholder inclusion. Now that we have the space for discussion, if this is something we could maybe hear, when we talk about enhancing access, what does this look like? And elaborate on maybe some of these factors.
Thanks a lot. And of course, thanks for the comments that have come. I mean, there is, as I said, there's one thing about setting up mechanisms and implementing them on the ground. And I think these two processes need to go hand in hand. And I think what we see is, of course, we have these a few countries where we are testing what could and could not happen with loss and damage, which is really important. But essentially, I think at least what I see and what I've observed through my research on this and my experience on the ground is normally the people that actually need most action don't even know that these mechanisms exist. The governments don't even let them know that that exists. So beyond actually thinking about grant areas like the World Bank, what are we doing to actually build capacity within national levels? Because just like other UN and UNCCC processes, there's no national government. There might be a board, there might be the World Bank, but the capacity for implementation is actually at the local level, at the national policy level. And what I see as a researcher and a policy researcher, I think much needs to happen on the ground in terms of data and research, which processes are being funded by loss and damage. And of course, the test of the 5 to 6 countries that have been selected, that is going to be good. But of course, what I'm trying to say is that we need to do a lot of groundwork phase. In addition to setting up mechanisms, data and research need to come along with those processes. And obviously, I think Lorriann, the last speaker, talked about the issue of equity and gender as criteria for action for loss and damage. I think, and Stella, you spoke about maximum impact of the loss and damage fund. I think this is where the groundwork comes in. So planning and strategy development to design and identify strategic areas of action with loss and damage. I understand there's need for, of course, having innovative funding mechanisms, but we don't need that. Or that's not even what people are looking for with the loss and damage. It's an issue of justice. And there is a lot of need. We don't need to be innovative. There is already a lot of innovations on the ground. We know where the resources need to come. I'll take an example, for example, of why loss and damage is leveraging many global South countries. We look at the issue of agriculture, for example. There's a lot of loss in that space. We look at the issue of water resources. There's a lot of loss in that space. We look at tourism. There's a lot of loss in that space. So loss of natural resources. There's a lot of loss. So we don't necessarily need to think about I mean, we could think about them and we could implement along them, but I'm saying that we should not buy time, as some, I think one has said that we need to already move quickly to directly inject the money to address those vulnerable communities' needs now and not wait to be innovative, because there is already a lot of innovation at the local level. When you look at adaptation, for example, and issues of resilience building, there is a lot of areas where money on loss and damage can be directly injected into the system right now, but without a proper mechanism in terms of institutional and capacity building at the national and local levels, this money is going to land on stone. And as we know, the proverb goes, if you plant on a stone, it doesn't germinate. So we really need fertile grounds where this money lands. So part of the investment of loss and damage should also think about investment in terms of institutional development and capacity building, and even communication of what this money looks like and what these, for example, could look like. And I know that people are thinking about these issues, but what I'm trying to emphasize here is that the thinking of the financing should go hand in hand with enabling condition or environments for which this financing is going to receive.
Stella, you have your hand raised. Please jump in.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I just really wanted to react to what Grace was saying, because I fully agree with that kind of local dimension of not only the problems, but also of the solutions and of the knowledge of the communities that have been experiencing the impacts of climate change in what are the best ways of dealing it. And that is really kind of speaking to the need of really reaching those communities and those who are particularly vulnerable. And I think the fund really needs to kind of see what are the mechanisms that ensure that it's not just kind of country driven, but also, the country drivenness includes that perspective from the local level. But in terms of capacity building, I also wanted just to bring here this element of the Santiago network, which is the network that can provide technical assistance. It is only starting to operate. But I think now as both the Santiago network and the fund are becoming operational, they can really look at how they can synergize between each other and how, for for instance, technical assistance can be used to build some of the local capacity and perhaps prepare some of the national response plans that then could be used for accessing a broader funding from the fund. So I think there are ideas there. And I also wanted to agree with what Pooja was saying in terms of making sure that once the funds are there, that there can be like in very quick disbursement to those communities and those countries that are feeling the impact. So definitely that is something that the fund board is looking at. There needs to be a need to kind of have this fast and efficient disbursement of the funding and making sure that it gets where it needs to be and that there are no disproportionate bureaucratic obstacles. But I think that's where you also can think, or the fund can think, how it complements the other existing structures and existing funds, because there may be actors who are already on the scene and can kind of, the fund could complement what they are doing. So there could be a connection with the humanitarian actors and programs, and ensuring that the gap between this kind of very short-term life-saving response from humanitarian actors can be then bridged by the funding coming from the fund as it responds with programs that are more mid to long-term. And that should also include kind of promotion of anticipatory action to reduce the magnitude of impacts, but also, as Grace was saying before, making sure that when we respond to loss and damage, we also mitigate the future impacts, which I think is really key to resilience. But that also doesn't cover the question of the slow onset events. And that was one of the areas that was highlighted as one of the gaps, perhaps, in the financing landscape. So I think the fund will also need to answer the questions on how do you provide some triggers or thresholds to have disbursements for those type of situations. And then the last point that perhaps is worth mentioning here, and there's a possibility in the governing instrument for reaching the small communities and civil society organizations, is the small grants possibility. And I think on all those kind of aspects, we would be very keen to hear inputs on how they could be operationalized in the next steps for the board. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And I'm being conscientious of time, and we have 15 minutes left, and we also would like to hear from all of our speakers one final time, but I also realize we have some questions in the Q&A that need addressing. So I propose that maybe we go around to each speaker, perhaps in the order of initial interjection, and we can use this as an opportunity for any final remarks to other speakers, but also attempting to reach some of these questions in the chat. There are some more technical questions when it comes to loss and damage, some question, or the fund, a question about perspectives on the donor base, and then also a question on whether or not, this question of the net zero revolution is due to the EU's own energy independent needs, and perhaps a question of vulnerability of loss and damage to the surge of far right that we're seeing in Europe. And so I just have to remember the order that we originally spoke in. Maybe we'll go backwards then. So we just heard from Stella. So maybe we can hear Lorriann from you first, and then we could go to Grace and then Sebastian after that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'm just trying to see which question to respond to. Many of these, there's one question about would developing countries perspectives, what are the perspectives on the donor base for the loss and damage fund? And I don't claim to speak for developing countries. I think it's an interesting question. And what is the role of China within this? I think it's an interesting question. I've been looking at, in my own research, I've been looking at black carbon emissions reduction, which is a very niche technical area. And one of the things that I've learned from that piece of work is just the extent to which so often countries like the US, China, and others will play out their own diplomatic priorities within these intergovernmental systems and processes in terms of which things are highlighted and which things are not, etc. So I think, on the one hand, I don't think you can have an apolitical approach to the loss and damage fund. It is a political process. And I understand that also in the development of the conversations, there were lots of the US, my understanding is that the US had a lot of objections. Please tell me if I'm wrong, some of you would be much closer to it, but my understanding is that the US had a lot of objections about even the name, and there are some countries who reject the idea that it's preparatory, etc. I feel like, so I guess what I'm getting to is that all of the kind of, and if you just think about what's happening right now in the world, all of the kind of big foreign policy, political issues, they're playing out in these international processes all the time. They will be there in the background in these discussions about loss and damage. And there's just a line to be walked between trying to find the consensus and do the practical work of trying to get it implemented in a way that speaks to the priorities of the communities that are affected by climate impacts. And for me, they're the test, and they're the big audience. And yeah, that awareness about the geopolitics and the relations between China and others, it's not a distraction. I think you have to be cognizant to it. But I don't see but I think we just have to find ways to work through it and try to make progress almost in spite of it, because it isn't going away. And I've genuinely been surprised by the extent to which what seems like neutral processes can also be tools in people's just diplomatic strategies of maybe I'll stop there, but yeah, those are my thoughts.
Thank you very much, Lorriann, and we will go to Grace now. Thank you. You're muted.
Yeah. Someone asked a question about addressing aversion of loss and damage through planting of mangroves. And I think loss and damage is, we are talking about past, but we are also trying to prevent further loss and damage. And this is where I said, perhaps in terms of the actions local communities are doing at the local level, for example, the planting of mangroves, this is really important. It is a contribution to averting loss and damage. And that means, of course, we won't need much if we all do our part in terms of protecting further damage, then we are obviously then also limiting the amount of money that is needed to these processes. But I also would like to add and say that while we talk about loss and damage in terms of past loss and damage, we have to also take into account communities now. And as Stella also was emphasized, of course, most of the loss and damages are taking place at the local level. And as I said, any climate change action is local. It's local in Germany, for Germany trying to, of course, phase out its fossil fuels and have more green, more sustainable energy sources. So I think ideally, we cannot look at loss and damage in a silo, as was already mentioned. We have to look at it in its complexity of climate action. So as part of a bigger picture, and of course, not limiting ourselves in addressing other issues, for example, adaptation, mitigation, in favor of just loss and damage. So it's really one piece of the puzzle in the match of the work that is needed within the climate change space. But I just also want to remind us that as much as we are having processes to address loss and damage in Global South countries, it's really important to also take their perspectives and also incorporate them in our thinking. Because if, for example, you go to a Global South country and say, well, we are going to move this money of loss and damage and put it into insurance because we think this is the place in which it can make more impact. This is something that is not going to be accepted by a lot of Global South countries because this is not how they see it. And I think this is then the perspective of both the Global North and Global South. Finding consensus in these issues will be difficult, but at least it's good to bring ourselves in the shoes of both sides so we can be able to build a space in which we are not bringing these things to a standstill, but there's a sense of progress. And as Pooja said, in terms of what is actually needed and how we should look at things, I mean, there's no one right thing. We just need to understand that there are some things that don't necessarily sound really good, especially when we think about the aspect of the climate justice aspect of all this. Why at all we're addressing the issue of climate change is maybe should not escape our thinking in terms of progress, and of course bringing everyone along, which is key also to the processes in terms of sustainability and acceptance.
Thank you very much for these final thoughts. And I think it segues nicely to Sebastian to hear some of your final thoughts, I guess, on statements in these questions. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also had a look at the chat, and there's lots of ideas around what the fund could finance. I mean, the question about joint application, I interpret that as things happening on a level above the national level. Then also whether there's local access to the fund, local organizations, but also local governments. I mean, if you look at the governing instrument, direct access means national level, means regional level, means subnational level. It also means direct access for civil society organizations. I don't see anything preventing us from investing into anything sort of above the national level. So all these are possibilities, but all of these need to be discussed in the board and need to be enshrined in the actual operational model of the fund, which is why the discussions that lie ahead of us are so important. And I mean, I asked for ideas in the beginning. I always happen to listen to those. I think that's what we need right now. And in that spirit, are very grateful for hearing from Lorriann, and also what Grace just said. I said that in a little provocative way. I'm aware that many things there are reservations against many things. By people, by governments in the global south. There are reservations against some of the things by governments in the global north. You've mentioned some of those. We're trying, as a German seat on that board, to be very open about those things. As I said in the beginning, the governing instrument has a lot to offer, and we stand behind everything it has to offer. And we should be looking into everything that's there. And if we do that, I think we really have a window of opportunity here to do something new, something innovative, something that will shape the discussion. And I can only encourage everyone to have come along and do that. The questions on the donor base, also very interesting. I alluded to that as well. It doesn't only mean China. There are other countries who have fossil business models or who are large emitters. Of course, for us, it would be very important to see those countries join in, as we've seen it with the United Arab Emirates, which we commended very much for doing that. I think that's important for this to be perceived as just in the global south, but also in the global north as well. And then finally, to one of the questions, whether anticipatory action is something that could be financed. I mean, I do think that if we want to be able to react quickly out of the fund, we need to pre-arrange things. And I know that pre-arranged finance for many is something that is perceived as talking about insurance. It is not. It is something, you pre-arrange what happens in the case of an event. You can pre-arrange disbursements through social security mechanisms or whatever. These are things that we need to talk about if we want to deliver quickly. We can't afford to be another GCF that takes a year to deliver on a proposal. That's not what loss and damage is about, obviously. And then, of course, we need to look at the full breadth of what we're doing. The fund is called the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. That's I think, very important, because it means averting, minimizing, and addressing, and not to, again, dilute from the addressing, but because this is one and the same thing. If we invest in this, we need to make sure that we're not only addressing things after they happen, but that we prepare for things, that we avert things, that we minimize things happening. So really trying to lobby for people to have an open mind on this. And I'm really looking forward to this journey that has been going very constructively so far, and that I hope we can continue in record speed. Thank you, Brooke. Thank everyone for this good discussion.
Thank you, Sebastian. And Pooja, any final thoughts on the matter?
Just to complement what Sebastian also said, that I truly agree that we need to learn from the experiences that we already have. We don't need to draw from all those things that happened with GCF, or for that matter of fact, adaptation fund, and look at the challenges of the adaptation fund and how smaller that fund is right now because of the existing challenges. But while we speak to that, I also want to draw our attention to the donor-based question that was raised, that while, yes, obviously, China is more than welcome to contribute if it is willing to, but it should be in terms of voluntary contribution. The legal obligation within UNFCCC and Paris Agreement is still within those historic polluters, and they need to provide those means of implementation. They need to provide those financial assistance that is needed. So they can do so in the larger framework when we see of the whole finance piece within UNFCCC and also in CQG, that they need to be the first one to provide and to contribute. And then as we slowly build up, the others can voluntarily do so, but it again should be based on the core principles that we have within UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. So that's how we need to go about looking at the donor contribution as well, that we should not oblige those who are not in the capacity to do so, because they are at the front line experiencing those impacts right now, and we are asking them to donate, which is not also wise enough. And with that, I'll close.
Thank you so much. And that brings us to Stella, our final interjections of the day. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all of the speakers. I think that was really an excellent discussion, and very happy to bring those thoughts to our board member Jan, so that he can learn about those discussions. I don't want to repeat what has been said. A lot of good thoughts already. I think maybe a kind of a general message on making sure that while we respond to loss and damage through the fund and other means, we also build resilience, but we also kind of help countries prepare and have capacity to be able to deal with further impacts, and that we do not forget, of course, the highest possible ambition on mitigation, which is absolutely necessary to avoid further impacts. And in addition to the fund that we were focusing a lot today, maybe just to mention that we also have high expectations from the broader funding arrangements and this high-level dialogue that we expect to be launched at COP29, which I think will also help us bring the further landscape together and talk about how some of the gaps could be plugged and how actors can collaborate. So with that, I will close my thoughts for today. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That brings us perfect timing. So thank you so much to our speakers for these final remarks and our discussion more generally today, and also to our audience, of course. And that marks the end of our event today. I wish you all a pleasant evening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.